Demon Souls is an interesting game to me, and this is coming from someone who loves the Souls games, and I find Demon Souls to be really unique compared to the other ones. And this isn't just because it was the first Souls game, but because of a lot of the story behind it too. Demon Souls was never supposed to actually be Demon Souls. Sony had approached From Software asking them for an exclusive RPG to rival that of Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and of course, that's not what they got. Far from it, actually. Demon Souls had an extremely rough development process, as you might be able to imagine. There was never really a prototype created for this game that was considered a success. At the time, the now president of the company, Hidetaka Miyazaki, had taken over as director for the game after it was already considered a failure before it even got its feet off the ground. And Miyazaki stated in an interview with The Guardian about why he wanted to even run the project in the first place. The project had problems, and the team had been unable to create a compelling prototype. But when I heard it was a fantasy action role-playing game, I was excited. I figured if I could find a way to take control of the game, I could turn it into anything I wanted, and best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure. Miyazaki had a vision, a game with quote-unquote back-to-basics concepts, and quote-unquote a game-like game. Even saying something that was fun in the way games used to be. It appears Miyazaki had a few ideas for what this meant. A game that didn't pander to players, it required trial and error. He wanted this game to be difficult and rewarding. This was at a time where games were becoming less challenging and more streamlined in general. With UI becoming more cramped, more information shown to players, story being spoon-fed to you. How games kind of are nowadays, the quote-unquote modern game design. And Demon Souls was basically the opposite of that, and Miyazaki knew this. It's known now that Miyazaki's ideal game is what the Souls series is, with Elden Ring being the closest thing to his ideal game so far. And Demon Souls is the first step towards Miyazaki's vision of his ideal game. And that's pretty incredible to me, honestly, because the reception of the game was awful on release. It was, in all definitions, a failure. It sold terribly, it had awful reception, not only after its release, but even before it came out. Hell, the president of Sony had even considered Demon Souls not only a failure, but a terrible game at the time. And despite all the negative reception and the disaster of its production, critical reception of the game was positive. Word of mouth spread enough that the game was able to release in the West, which it never was originally supposed to. It was supposed to just die locally in Japan. And as we can see now, Demon Souls was only the beginning, spawning the entire Souls series, including Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. The absolute success of this game in the long term even brought a remake of the game, showing a complete change in the perception of the game, with Sony now praising it, which even led to Bloodborne being a Sony exclusive as well. It's a true success story, and is only the background to a fantastically unique game. A lot of what I can say about this game can also be said about other games in the Souls series, so I want to try and focus on the things unique to this game. For me, the most unique aspect of Demon Souls is its atmospheres and variety of locations. Unlike other Souls games, this game uses archstones, which teleport you to vastly different, unique areas. There are 5 in the game that work. There was a 6th one that got cut before the game released because of development time, but you've got 5 different ones. You have the very human Palace of Altaria, the Descent into Hell with Stonefang tunnels, the tortured and tormented Tower of Latria, the Bone Zone of the Shrine of Storms, and the desolate despair of the Valley of Defilement. And each area has its own unique set of enemies, atmosphere, and theming, making it clear that no areas are directly connected to one another, allowing each area to just do its own thing without being hindered by one another. And unlike other Souls games, Demon Souls has a much more linear approach to level design. There are shortcuts and secrets within the areas, but generally speaking, there's very obvious paths and routes leading straight to each boss in the game. And this really was the early stages of Souls level design, but they work incredibly well and still offer enough confusion and maze-like structure to make newer players become completely lost, even in relatively small areas. It makes replaying the game faster each time when you actually know what you're doing. You can basically complete each archstone in under an hour because they're just small bites just kind of mixed together. Speaking of knowing what you're doing, one thing you can quickly notice about each archstone is that the enemies within each area typically have their own weaknesses and strengths, making each area feel more unique. This is something you don't see as prominently in future Souls titles, where enemy defenses usually don't matter, won't really impact your style of play. But Demon's Souls is pretty different in this aspect, and there's a handful of enemies that are very resistant to certain types of damage, making a large incentive to have multiple weapons, or to have a weapon that can do multiple types of damages. And this is why magic, I think, is considered so powerful in the game as well. It's just super easy to slot different types of magic in and still deal a whole bunch of damage, on top of enemies not really being very magic resistant. But these resistances can make your playthroughs really interesting. You might prefer using a slashing weapon and skip past Stonefang tunnels and the Shrine of Storms because those enemies are resistant to it, while someone that prefers blunt or pierce weapons might do the Shrine of Storms or Stonefang first. A lot of new players might go into Stonefang with a slashing weapon their first time around and not realize that if they just go and get a quick thrusting weapon like a spear, it makes the entire area significantly easier. But it makes this game much more challenging on a blind playthrough because each area has its own unique challenges presented. And it all just seems to relate back to the design philosophy of trial and error. Demon's Souls has a lot in the game that with the right amount of knowledge kind of just trivializes it. Think about the Phalanx Demon or Maiden Estrella, the Tower Knight, or the Storm King. In general, the bosses of Demon's Souls are the most gimmicky of the entire series, making them some of the easiest bosses in the series, given you know what you're doing, and they don't really pose much of a threat. But to me, that's what makes this game so unique. Each boss feels more like a puzzle than they do a boss fight. Instead of me just saying that though, let me show you what I mean. The first real boss in this game is the Phalanx Demon. It's made up of a bunch of blobs with shields. They can be very difficult if you try to face them head on. And if you pay attention enough throughout the level, you notice you find a whole bunch of fire bombs and turpentine that make your weapon be set on fire. And it turns out this boss is super weak to fire, so if you just use those fire bombs and stuff, you can easily open it up and just melt it down. It trivializes the whole thing. But one example is not getting my point across, so let's look at the Adjudicator. It will only take damage if you hit its head, but if you attack its stomach enough, it'll fall over and then you can just go hit its head for free. So if you just rush to the bottom of the arena and hit its stomach, it can't really do anything to you. I think that the whole gimmick is that people will try to hit it from up above and then realize, oh, well that just doesn't work. So if you just go to the bottom, the boss really can't touch you. Or here's one that I think a lot of players usually have challenge with, the Old Hero. His boss is blind, so it reacts to the sounds you make. And lucky enough for you, there's this little thing called the Thief's Ring, and it makes you almost completely undetectable to this boss. If you just wear the Thief's Ring, you just go behind him. Doesn't matter if you're running, if you're rolling, whatever you're doing, he's just not going to know you're there. So you just hit him from the back, he'll flail around and not be able to hit you. Alright, but what about the archdemons, the strongest demons of each area? Well, the Dragon God is not able to be directly attacked until you activate 2 ballistas around its arena. You just have to ignore its detection, break some rocks, fire the ballistas, and then you can hit its shin. It's really tedious, but not difficult whatsoever. Or the Storm King. You get a weapon called the Storm Roller. It is the only weapon besides bows that can actually hit the thing. You just use it and you kill it. It barely attacks you, it barely does anything. It's just a really cool fight. Okay, but what about the Valley of Defilement, Maiden Estrella? The arena is the hardest part of this fight. So just ignore it. Go fight her bodyguard. That's all you have to do. You can easily parry him, or you just bait him out and you go and fight her. If you kill the bodyguard, she just kills herself.
Dearest destroyer, I failed you.
You killed him, didn't you? Very well. I can no longer resist you. Do as you like.
It is that easy. Also, shout out, because that's like my favorite boss music in a Souls game. But like 80% of the bosses in this game are just gimmick fights. They aren't actually difficult unless you have no idea what the gimmick is. It's not to mention that the balance of the game is also kind of finicky. You can tackle any area you want at any time, meaning they needed to balance each archstone accordingly. Essentially, this splits each archstone into mini zones with ramping difficulty. But this allows players to approach each archstone at any pace that they want to. And you can play through all of Stonefang in one go if you wanted and then move on, or you could do one boss in an archstone and move to the next. The one potential problem with this design is that if you play through one entire archstone and then go to another, the early stages of that archstone are way easier because you're going to be like quote unquote over leveled. But at the same time, it's not a massive problem because of the way weapon scaling works in the game. Scaling isn't nearly as powerful as other Souls games, making each weapon feel both relatively weak and strong at the same time. It's not to say there isn't any scaling or powerful weapons, but the way weapons upgrade and scale pales in comparison to future titles. But overall, Demon Souls just feels like a beta version of Dark Souls. Because it pretty much is, and it's not a bad thing. There's so much in this game that was reinvented and improved upon in further iterations of the Souls games that all just started right here. You want a good example? Look at the vault mechanic. This isn't even mandatory unless you play the tutorial in the remake, and it was never seen in any other Souls games and got replaced with a jump mechanic. And that wouldn't be useful until Elden Ring came out over a decade later. But for a game that was doomed to fail at every turn and was the first iteration of a completely new idea, it's fantastic to see what we ended up with. Thank you for watching though. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe, whatever you want. Have a good one.
The Old One senses a new and powerful demon by its side. And before long, the world will be engulfed by the deep fog. Bring more souls.